The morning sun beat down harshly on the crowded city streets, casting long shadows on the pavement. New York, in all its glory, seemed to be awake before dawn. People hurried in all directions, each with their own destination, as if the city itself were a living, breathing organism. Cars honked, buses screeched, and somewhere in the distance, the unmistakable sound of construction echoed through the air. It was just another chaotic day in the life of Emily Carter, a young woman whose life had been meticulously planned down to the smallest detail. Emily had always been the picture of success, or at least, that was the image she worked tirelessly to project. With her sleek, dark hair tied into a tight bun and her power suit that screamed authority, she looked every bit the part of a high-powered corporate executive. In the fast-paced world of finance, Emily had managed to carve out a name for herself. Today was no different. She was on her way to yet another important meeting with a client who could potentially offer her a major promotion. Her phone was glued to her ear as she spoke rapidly, discussing last-minute details of the deal she was about to close. The rush of adrenaline from negotiating important terms kept her sharp, her mind focused on the outcome, not on anything else. But the world has a funny way of throwing curveballs when least expected. As Emily walked, her thoughts consumed with numbers and projections, she failed to notice the shift in her environment. The crowd thickened as she approached an intersection, people moving in and out of her path. The air smelled of fresh coffee, exhaust fumes, and the faint aroma of street vendors hawking pretzels and hot dogs. Despite the chaotic atmosphere, Emily felt oddly at ease, a sense of comfort in the routine. But that feeling would soon be shattered. Without warning, a figure stepped into her path. He was tall, scruffy, and looked like he'd been living on the streets for far longer than anyone should. His clothes were torn, his hair matted, and his beard, unkempt and wild, almost concealed his entire face. He sat hunched against a building, an old tattered cardboard sign in his hands, but his eyes, those eyes, seemed to carry a weight, a heaviness that drew Emily's gaze despite herself. She glanced at him for only a second, dismissing him as yet another person in the sea of homeless faces that dotted the city. But then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her cut through the noise of the city. A sudden shift in the air made her stomach tighten. Something wasn't right. The quickening pace of the footsteps grew louder, and Emily's instincts screamed that danger was close. Her thoughts raced. Should she look over her shoulder? Should she walk faster? But before she could make a decision, it happened. A hand, strong and firm, shot out from the chaos behind her. It grabbed her purse, yanking it with such force that Emily stumbled forward. The strap of her bag dug into her shoulder, but the thief didn't care. He was faster than she could react, pulling at the bag and dragging her helplessly with it. The panic surged through her. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. Her heart hammered in her chest, and for a split second, she felt completely powerless. The sharp, metallic taste of fear flooded her mouth. Was this how it was going to end? A simple robbery? Or worse, would she be hurt? Just as her body tensed, bracing for the inevitable violence, something unexpected happened. A rough, callous hand shot out from the side, gripping the assailant's wrist with a force that made the thief freeze. The homeless man, the one she had barely noticed seconds ago, was now standing between her and the attacker. His eyes, those eyes she had briefly locked with before, flared with a determination that sent an unexpected wave of relief through Emily's veins. Let go of her. The man's voice was low but commanding, cutting through the panic like a knife. His words weren't a suggestion. They were an order. The thief, taken aback by the sudden intervention, hesitated. He turned to look at the homeless man, sizing him up for a moment. But whatever he saw in the stranger's eyes made him think twice. Perhaps it was the raw intensity in those eyes or the presence of something dangerous, something that said this man was capable of much more than just sitting on a street corner. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The two men locked eyes, the tension crackling in the air. The thief slowly released his grip on Emily's purse, but he didn't flee immediately. Instead, he backed away slowly, muttering curses under his breath, before vanishing into the crowd. It all happened so quickly. One moment, Emily was certain she was about to be robbed or worse, and the next, she was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, safe and sound, her bag still in her hands. Emily stood frozen, her chest heaving as she tried to process what had just happened. Her heart was still racing, but her mind couldn't quite catch up. The homeless man turned to walk away, his movements slow but deliberate. It was as though the whole encounter had been nothing more than a casual inconvenience for him. He didn't even look back at her. "Wait!" Emily called out, her voice shaking, not entirely sure why she had shouted. Perhaps it was gratitude. Maybe it was curiosity. But more than anything, it was a need to understand what had just transpired. The man paused, but didn't turn around. He stood there for a moment, his broad back facing her. "Who are you?" Emily asked, her words coming out more forcefully than she intended. "Why did you help me?" The man didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, as though contemplating whether it was worth responding at all. Finally, he spoke, his voice gravelly and distant. "Does it matter?" His words were short, almost dismissive. "You're safe. That's all that matters." And with that, he began walking toward the alleyway nearby, disappearing into the shadows with the same ease as someone vanishing into the backdrop of a forgotten memory. Emily stood there, her body still trembling with the aftereffects of adrenaline. She wanted to run after him, to ask more questions, to know more about who this man was, why he had helped her. But for reasons she couldn't explain, she didn't. Instead, she just watched him disappear, the image of the homeless man imprinted on her mind. She stood there for several moments, trying to piece together the events that had just unfolded. Who was he? What had motivated him to help her, a stranger? For the first time that day, Emily felt a sense of confusion wash over her. A homeless man, rough, gruff, and living on the fringes of society, had just saved her life. And in the blink of an eye, he was gone, leaving behind more questions than answers. The city was still buzzing around her, but Emily felt like she was moving in slow motion. Her heart had finally settled into a steady rhythm, but her mind refused to let go of the images that had flashed through her head only moments ago. The homeless man's face, rough and unkempt, was etched in her mind, his piercing eyes like a window to a world she didn't understand. She should have kept walking. She should have gone to her meeting, pushed the encounter out of her mind like she had done countless times before with the faceless people of the city. But for some reason, she couldn't. She found herself staring down the alley where the man had disappeared, wondering who he was, why he had stepped in, and, most importantly, what had driven him to act. Her fingers were still trembling as she dialed her assistant, giving instructions for the meeting that was about to start in an hour. She was trying to push everything from her mind, but the incident kept pulling her back. There was something unsettling about it, a nagging feeling that wouldn't let go. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, emails, and conference calls. Emily had closed the deal with her client, securing the promotion she had been working toward for months, but her success felt hollow. The homeless man's intervention was still on her mind, and she found herself distracted, staring out of her office window during meetings, unable to concentrate. On her way home one evening, she took the same route, hoping that the memory of the alley would fade with time. But when she rounded the corner, she saw him again, the homeless man. He was sitting against the wall of the same building, his cardboard sign leaning against his leg, his face covered by the same unkempt hair. He looked almost like a ghost, a constant presence on the streets. This time, Emily didn't look away. She felt drawn to him, as though some invisible thread was pulling her closer. She didn't know why. She had never cared about the homeless before, never felt the need to stop and ask their stories. But there was something about him. As she walked past him, she paused, glancing down at him. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter than she had intended, "for what you did the other day." The man didn't look up, but he shifted slightly, his voice gruff as he spoke. "You don't owe me anything," he replied, his words distant, as though he wasn't fully present. "I did what anyone would have done." Emily wasn't so sure about that. He hadn't looked like anyone. He had acted with the precision of someone who had seen far more danger than a casual bystander. But she couldn't explain why she felt so sure of that. There was something about his aura, something about the way he stood between her and the attacker that felt deliberate. "I just want to know who you are," Emily said, her voice softer now. "Why did you help me?" The man finally looked up at her. His eyes, dark and full of shadows, met hers for a brief moment. It wasn't the kind of look she was used to, a glance that held no judgment or expectation. He wasn't looking at her with pity, nor with any hint of longing. There was no sense of desperation in his gaze. It was almost like he was observing her, studying her as much as she was him. His lips parted, but before he could speak, a noise from down the street caught both of their attention. A group of teenagers were approaching, laughing and shouting, their voices filled with the usual brashness of youth. The homeless man tensed for a moment, his body rigid, but then he relaxed, his gaze once again turning back to the ground in front of him. Emily took a deep breath. "I don't have time to talk right now," she said, stepping away. "But maybe I'll see you again." The man didn't respond, and she wasn't sure if he was even listening. But something inside her, something she didn't quite understand, told her that this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. The next day, Emily couldn't focus. She kept thinking about the man's eyes, the moment when their gazes locked. It wasn't just a random act of kindness. It felt significant, like there was more to him than met the eye. She couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter was leading her somewhere. She had to know more. That night, she found herself walking down the same street again, her feet moving almost on their own accord. She didn't know why she was doing this, why she was looking for him, this stranger who had come into her life with no warning and left her with more questions than answers. She tried to dismiss the urge. This was foolish. She had bigger things to focus on. But when she reached the corner, she saw him. This time, he was standing near the alley, his back against the brick wall, staring into the distance. His posture was different, straighter, as if he were waiting for something or someone. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but before she could second-guess herself, she walked up to him. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice tentative. The man turned his head slowly, as though he hadn't expected to see anyone, especially her. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, followed by something else, a sadness, a resignation. "I'm fine," he said simply. "I don't need anyone's help." Emily didn't know what compelled her to ask, but she found herself saying, "If you ever need something, anything, I can help you. I have resources. I can help you get off the streets." His eyes darkened. For a moment, Emily thought he might laugh, but he didn't. Instead, he took a step closer to her, his face now only inches away. "You think you can save me?" he asked, his voice rough, almost bitter. "You think you can fix me just because you have money or a suit or whatever it is that makes you think you're better than me?" Emily was taken aback. She didn't expect the hostility. She wasn't trying to save him. She was offering help, but the way he said it made her pause. "I don't think I'm better than you," she said, holding his gaze. "I just think that maybe you don't have to live like this." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city continued around them, but the space between them felt thick with tension. Finally, the man spoke again, his tone softer this time, as if the anger had drained from him. "Maybe," he muttered, almost to himself. "But it's not that simple." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows once more. Emily stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened, her mind swirling with thoughts and questions. Why had he reacted that way? What was he hiding? There was more to this man than just a homeless figure. Something about him felt familiar, yet entirely unknown. She had a feeling her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The following morning, Emily awoke to the familiar sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She groggily reached for it, her mind still clouded with the remnants of the dreams she'd had. It was one of those dreams that didn't make sense at the time, but stayed with you long after you woke up. Fragments of shadows and voices. And, inexplicably, the face of the homeless man. She shook her head, dismissing the thoughts, and opened her eyes fully. Another busy day awaited her, full of meetings, decisions, and the constant buzz of corporate life. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on the demands of her job, her mind kept drifting back to the man. Who was he? What was it about him that stirred something in her? A sense of curiosity and, dare she say, empathy? After a quick breakfast and an hour of back-to-back calls, Emily found herself once again standing at the corner of the street where she had last seen him. This time, however, she wasn't walking to her office. Her feet seemed to carry her here without conscious thought, as though something deep inside her was guiding her. She didn't know why, but the unanswered questions from the previous night lingered in her mind. Was there a story behind those eyes that she had yet to understand? The street was bustling with its usual crowd. People walking briskly, heads down, consumed by their own world. Yet, for some reason, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within her since her encounter with him. She walked slowly, trying to absorb the life around her, but her gaze kept darting toward the alley where he had disappeared. This time, there was no sign of him. Her shoulders slumped in disappointment, but she refused to let it deter her. She lingered there for a few moments, trying to get a sense of where he might have gone. But the street was crowded with so many people, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. He had become a part of her day now. This stranger who had saved her without hesitation, yet remained an enigma in her life. Her phone rang again, breaking her thoughts. It was her assistant, reminding her of an important meeting she was supposed to attend in half an hour. Sighing, Emily looked around one last time before heading back to her office. The rest of the day was a blur, and by the time evening rolled around, Emily had almost convinced herself that the encounter had been a one-off event, an isolated moment in time that didn't need further investigation. She had a job to do, after all, but as she prepared to leave the office, she found herself once again walking toward that same corner. This time, however, she didn't have to search for him. There he was. The man sat on the curb near the same alley, his back resting against the brick wall, as though he had been waiting for her. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and she found herself walking toward him before her mind could catch up with her body. When she reached him, she didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to explain the strange feeling that had overtaken her in the past few days. The man looked up at her, his eyes narrow, as though he had been expecting her all along. "You keep coming back," he said, his voice gravelly, almost amused. "What's your story?" Emily hesitated, but then she found herself sitting down beside him on the curb. The sounds of the city continued around them, but in that moment, it felt as though the world had paused, leaving only the two of them in the space between. She glanced at him, the same rough, weathered figure she had seen several days ago, but now there was something different in his presence. He wasn't just some random homeless man. There was a depth to him, an untold story hidden in his silence. "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice soft, almost embarrassed. "I can't stop thinking about you." His eyebrows raised slightly, but he said nothing, his gaze never leaving her face. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand. I'm just another person in this city. Why did you step in?" The man remained silent for a long moment, as if weighing her question. Finally, he spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "I don't do things because they make sense," he said, his voice tinged with something that sounded like bitterness. "Sometimes, you just do what feels right. It's not about understanding. It's about surviving." Surviving. The word echoed in Emily's mind. She had spent her life working for a corporate empire, where success was measured by promotions, numbers, and deadlines. But survival? That was a word she had never truly understood. Surviving. she repeated softly, almost as if tasting the word. What do you mean by that? The man glanced down at his hands, his fingers clenched tightly around the cardboard sign he had been holding. You think I want to be here? He said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. You think I chose this life? I don't have the luxury of making choices. Some of us, he paused, taking a breath, some of us don't have options. You can walk away from this, but I can't. I never could. Emily's heart clenched at the rawness in his words. It was hard to imagine the life he described. The struggle, the constant fight just to survive. I didn't mean to offend you, she said, her tone gentle, her words sincere. I just wanted to understand. I thought maybe you could help me understand things I've never really thought about. The man turned his head toward her, his eyes narrowing again. This time, however, they held a glimmer of something, a flicker of curiosity. You think you want to understand? What's the point? He asked, his voice quiet, as though speaking more to himself than to her. Understanding doesn't change anything. It doesn't make the world any less cold. It doesn't give me a roof over my head or food in my stomach. Emily felt the sting of his words, but she couldn't shake the sense that there was more to him than the exterior he projected. He was a man of mystery, a man with a history, and somewhere, hidden beneath that rough exterior, was a person, someone who had been through things she couldn't even imagine. You're wrong, she said suddenly, her voice firm, surprising even herself. Understanding does change things. If we don't try to understand each other, we're all just going through the motions, existing in our own little bubbles. We're not really living. The man didn't reply immediately, and for a moment, Emily wondered if she had said too much. But then he looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time, as though seeing her in a different light. You're a strange one, he said finally, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Emily smiled back, though she was unsure whether it was in response to his comment or because she had finally started to feel like they were having a real conversation. For the first time since meeting him, Emily felt like she was starting to see the man as more than just a figure on the street. There was something there, something important, and it felt as though the puzzle pieces of their worlds were beginning to fit together, slowly, cautiously, but with the promise of something deeper. But what that was, Emily didn't know yet. She only knew that she couldn't walk away from him again. Not this time. The days that followed felt like an endless dance between curiosity and hesitation. Emily found herself returning to the same spot every evening, her steps almost automatic, as if her feet had a mind of their own. She knew it was strange, this growing fixation she had on the homeless man. But every time she walked by, she saw something new, a flicker of humanity in his eyes, a flash of something deeper than the worn-out exterior he projected. She still didn't understand it. She had no reason to be so drawn to him. He was nothing like the polished professionals she worked with, nothing like the world she had known her entire life. But in a way, that was exactly why she couldn't stop thinking about him. He represented a world she had ignored for so long, a world that existed just beneath the surface of her own. One evening, as the golden light of the setting sun bathed the street in warmth, Emily found herself walking the familiar path to the alley. But tonight felt different. The air had a certain weight to it, a heaviness that made her pulse quicken as she turned the corner. She knew deep down that something was about to shift, something that would change everything. And there he was, sitting on the curb, just like the night before, but this time there was a sense of stillness around him, as if the noise of the city, the honking cars, and the people rushing by didn't touch him. He was untouched by the world, like a silent observer in a sea of chaos. When he saw her approach, he didn't speak immediately. He simply watched her, his eyes soft yet intense, as if he were waiting for her to say something first. You're always here, Emily said quietly, taking a seat beside him on the curb. He gave her a small nod, his expression unreadable. Yeah, he muttered, his voice low. Guess I am. Emily studied him, her gaze lingering on the roughness of his face, the lines around his eyes, the stubble on his chin. It all spoke of a life that had been weathered by something more than just the elements. But there was also a quiet strength in him, a resilience that caught her off guard. "You never told me your name," she said, breaking the silence. Her tone was casual, but there was an underlying question in her voice. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to give her that piece of himself. Finally, he sighed, his eyes softening. "It's Jack," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jack." Emily let the name settle in her mind. It was simple, unassuming, but it felt important. She wasn't sure why, but it did. "I'm Emily," she replied, offering him a smile. It felt strange, sitting here with him like this, so far removed from her usual life. But for some reason, it didn't feel wrong. It felt right, as though the pieces of her life were starting to align in a way she hadn't expected. There was a long pause between them, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Finally, Jack broke the silence. "You really want to know about me?" he asked, his tone guarded. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had asked herself that same question countless times over the past week. Did she really want to know about him? Did she want to understand the man behind the gruff exterior? The man who had saved her life without a second thought? "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "I do. I want to understand. I want to know why you did what you did." Jack's eyes hardened for a moment, and Emily could feel the shift in the air. It was as though she had opened a door he wasn't ready to walk through. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, as though gathering the courage to speak. "Why does anyone do what they do?" Jack said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Because they have no choice." Emily frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Jack's gaze drifted toward the busy street ahead of them, his eyes distant, lost in thought. For a moment, Emily thought he might not answer. But then, in a voice so quiet she almost missed it, he spoke. "There's a reason I'm out here," he began, his voice rough, as though the words had been buried for a long time. "I didn't just wake up one day and decide to be homeless. I didn't choose this life. It's a series of things that happened, a series of choices that weren't really mine to make." Emily felt a pang of sympathy. She had never considered the circumstances behind someone's homelessness, not really. She had seen it every day in the city, but it had always seemed like an abstract concept to her, something that existed outside her bubble of privilege. "Tell me," she said gently. "I want to listen. I want to understand." Jack looked at her, his expression hard to read. He seemed to study her for a long moment, as if searching for something in her face. Finally, he spoke, his words raw and heavy with the weight of his past. "I was married once," he said, his voice low. "Had a house, a job, a life that wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And then it all fell apart. Lost my job first. The company downsized. Then the bills started piling up. My wife, she couldn't handle the stress. She left, took the kids with her. And just like that, everything I worked for was gone." Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. She hadn't expected this, didn't know how to respond. She had always taken stability for granted. "It's not always easy," Jack continued, his voice growing more distant. "One thing leads to another, and before you know it, you're out on the streets. I didn't want this. I didn't ask for this. But I had nowhere else to go. And I'm not the only one. There are millions of us out here. People who've lost everything. Some of us don't get a second chance." Emily's heart clenched. She had heard stories about the homeless before, of course, but this was different. Jack's words weren't just facts or statistics. They were real. They were raw. They were the story of someone who had fallen through the cracks. "Is that why you helped me?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you know what it's like to lose everything." Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, his eyes flickering with something, maybe understanding, maybe pain. "I didn't help you because of what I've lost," he said quietly. "I helped you because I saw something in you that I couldn't ignore. I saw someone who didn't belong in that world. the world I'm trapped in, and I didn't want to see it take you too. His words lingered in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Emily didn't know what to say. There were no words that could truly capture the depth of what he had just shared with her. For a long time, they sat in silence, the sounds of the city fading away as Emily processed what she had just learned. She had come here to understand him, but in doing so, she had uncovered something about herself as well. There was a truth beneath the surface of every person, a story waiting to be told. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see the world in a way she had never seen it before. The city streets seemed to buzz louder as the days passed, but in the quiet moments when Emily sat with Jack, it was as if time itself slowed down. She found herself looking forward to these encounters more than anything else in her day. The hectic pace of her corporate life, the pressure to succeed, the constant rush of deadlines, none of that seemed to matter when she was with him. Jack had become something of an anchor in her world, pulling her back to a sense of reality she hadn't realized she was missing. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling meeting with her boss, Emily found herself once again walking toward the alley where Jack usually sat. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the promise of rain, but Emily hardly noticed. She had been spending more and more time thinking about him, about their conversations, and the way he had made her view the world through a completely different lens. He had opened up to her in ways she hadn't expected, and with each new detail of his past, she felt a stronger pull toward him. When she rounded the corner, she found him in his usual spot, sitting with his legs crossed on the curb, his eyes closed as if lost in thought. Emily's footsteps faltered for a moment as she took him in. Despite the harshness of his life on the streets, there was something almost serene about the way he sat, like he had found a certain peace in the chaos around him. "Hey!" Emily called softly, her voice hesitant but warm. Jack opened his eyes and looked at her with a faint smile. "Hey, you!" he said, his voice hoarse but kind. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of their unspoken words hanging in the air. Emily had come here today not just to learn more about him, but also to learn more about herself. Jack had started to feel like a mirror, a reflection of the parts of her life that she had buried beneath her ambitions and corporate goals. He had shown her the value of simply being present, of slowing down, of living without the constant pressure to succeed. "I've been thinking," Emily said, sitting beside him, her tone a little more serious than usual. "I want to do something more. For you. For people like you." Jack raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism flickering in his eyes. "More? What does that even mean?" "I don't know yet," Emily admitted, shrugging. "But I can't keep walking past you every day and just go on with my life like nothing's wrong. I've been living in this bubble, in this perfect little world where everything's supposed to be okay. But I'm starting to see that not everyone has that luxury. Not everyone can just fix things with money or status." Jack's gaze softened as he listened, but there was still a hardness in his eyes, a wariness that spoke to the years of hurt and disappointment he had endured. "You don't have to do anything for me, Emily," Jack said, his voice quieter than usual. "I'm used to being on my own. I don't need charity. People like me, we survive, we adapt. You don't owe me anything." "I know you don't want charity," Emily replied quickly. "It's not about that. It's about understanding and doing something that makes a real difference. Maybe I can use the resources I have to help people who don't have the same opportunities. People like you." Jack looked at her, a skeptical expression on his face. "You think you can change anything? That's a lot to take on, you know. It's not that simple." Emily met his gaze, her heart beating faster as she realized just how deeply she felt about this. There was something in his words that struck her, something that made her question everything she had taken for granted. "I don't know if I can change everything," Emily said, her voice steady. "But I think I can try, and trying is better than doing nothing." The two sat in silence for a while, the soft rumble of thunder in the distance the only sound between them. Emily's thoughts were racing as she looked at Jack, trying to come up with a plan. trying to figure out what she could do to help. The weight of the world's problems seemed impossible to overcome. But in that moment, with Jack beside her, she felt a sense of clarity. "I don't have all the answers," she said finally. "But I think the first step is awareness. If people knew what it was like to live like you do, to be treated like you are invisible, maybe they'd care more. Maybe they'd do something." Jack remained quiet, and for a moment, Emily wondered if she had said too much. But then he spoke, his voice surprisingly soft. "You're right about one thing," he said, his tone more thoughtful now. "People don't understand. Most of the time, they don't even see us. But that doesn't mean we don't matter." "I don't think you're invisible," Emily said, her voice earnest. "I see you, and I don't think I can walk away from this now. I don't think I can go back to my old life after seeing things the way I do." Jack let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "You think that's easy? You think you can just walk in and fix things with a smile and a donation? It's a lot harder than that." "I don't expect it to be easy," Emily said firmly, "but I'm willing to try." For a moment, Jack said nothing, and Emily felt the weight of his silence. He was looking at her, studying her face as though he was trying to gauge whether she was serious. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But remember this, Emily. It's not about fixing people. It's about listening. It's about giving people a voice when no one else will." Emily nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. It wasn't about charity, about fixing Jack or the thousands of others in the city who lived like him. It was about changing the narrative, about giving them a chance to speak, a chance to be heard. "I understand," she said softly, "and I'm listening. I'll listen. I promise." Jack smiled, a genuine smile that made his eyes soften for the first time since she had met him. It wasn't a smile of hope, but rather one of acknowledgement, a recognition that, for the first time in a long while, someone cared enough to hear his story. The rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier, as the storm clouds finally burst open above them. Emily didn't care. She sat beside him, letting the rain wash over them both, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. This wasn't the world she had known, but maybe that was a good thing. Maybe this was the world she was meant to live in now. And in that moment, as the rain dripped down around them, Emily made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't walk away from Jack. She wouldn't walk away from this world, this story, and the countless others who were waiting to be heard. The change wouldn't come overnight, but she would start with one voice, and perhaps in time, more would join in. The following week passed in a blur. Emily couldn't seem to shake the conversations she'd had with Jack, nor the way his words had planted a seed of doubt in her mind about everything she had once thought was important. She had always believed that success was measured by the size of your paycheck, the prestige of your job, and the luxurious lifestyle you could afford. But now, she was beginning to question those ideals. What was success, really? Was it the hollow victories of boardroom meetings and increasing stock prices? Or was it something deeper, more meaningful? Something that could only be found by understanding the human experience in all its forms. Emily's thoughts were consumed by Jack. She spent her days at work in a fog, going through the motions of presentations and reports while her mind kept drifting back to their conversations. She couldn't let go of the idea of helping him, of doing something to make a real difference, not just for Jack, but for others like him. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had been living a life blind to the struggles of so many people. She had been so wrapped up in her own bubble of comfort that she had failed to see the world around her. One evening, after a long and frustrating day at the office, Emily found herself walking toward the alley again. This time, however, she wasn't just seeking Jack's company. She was going with a purpose. She had decided that it was time to take the first step, whatever that step might be. When she arrived at the alley, Jack was sitting in his usual spot, his back against a brick wall, staring at the sky. The moment he saw her, a small smile tugged at his lips. "You're back," he said, his voice laced with a quiet surprise, though not entirely unexpected. Emily smiled back, but there was a certain determination in her expression now, a fire that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking," she said as she sat down beside him, the sounds of the city humming softly in the background. "About what?" Jack asked, his eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity. "About what you said," Emily replied, her tone measured serious. "About listening. About not trying to fix people, but just hearing them. I realize that's what I need to do, listen. But I also think there's more I can do than just listen." Jack raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Oh, yeah? And what's that?" Emily took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. She couldn't change the world overnight, but maybe she could start with something small, something that could lead to bigger things. "I've been thinking about your situation, about all the people who are in a similar position," Emily began, her words coming out more confidently now. "And I want to try to help, not with charity, but with something real, something that could change things. I've been working in a world where money and status are the solutions to everything, but I know now that there's more to life than that. So I want to help make sure people like you aren't invisible anymore." Jack listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. There was something guarded in his expression, as though he was waiting for her to finish before passing judgment. Emily felt the weight of his silence. She had no idea what he was thinking, but she knew she couldn't back down now. "I don't know exactly what I'm going to do yet," she continued, her words growing more resolute. "But I want to start by creating awareness, by helping people understand what it's really like to be in your shoes. I want to bring attention to the real issues, mental health, lack of access to resources, homelessness, the broken systems that keep people trapped in poverty. And I want to use my skills, my job, my connections, whatever I can, to help make a change." Jack didn't speak for a long time, and Emily felt her heart race with uncertainty. Had she said too much? Was he just humoring her with his silence? She couldn't help but wonder if he thought she was just another naive person who didn't understand the complexities of homelessness. Finally, Jack broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "You're not the first person to try to help," he said, his words sharp but not unkind. "There have been others. They come in, make a lot of noise for a while, maybe start a charity or give a speech. But after a few weeks, they vanish. It's always the same story. The people who live on the streets, they don't need more talk. They need action, real action. And action doesn't come from people like you." Emily's chest tightened at his words, but she didn't look away. She understood his skepticism, his jaded view of the world. She had been naive once, too. But now, something inside her was determined to prove that she could be different. "I don't want to be like them," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm not going to just talk about it. I'm going to make sure that the people who need help actually get it. And if I can use my position, my influence, to do that, then that's what I'm going to do." Jack stared at her for a long time, and for a moment, Emily thought he was going to dismiss her, tell her that she didn't understand what it was really like, and that she would give up just like everyone else had. But then, something changed in his eyes. The hardness began to soften, just a little. "You know what," he said, his tone almost contemplative. "Maybe you'll be different. Maybe you won't just talk. But you're going to have to be ready for a fight. This world, it doesn't care about people like me. It doesn't care about people like you either, not really. But if you're serious about this, if you really want to make a difference, then you better get ready for the fight of your life." Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. She knew that Jack was right. It was going to be a long, hard battle. But as she sat beside him, feeling the weight of his words, she also felt something else. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could be the one to make a real change. "I'm ready," she said firmly, her gaze locking with his. "I'm ready for the fight." Jack gave her a nod, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "All right then, let's see what you're made of." The days that followed Emily's conversation with Jack were a whirlwind of planning and action. At first, it felt like a dream, an exciting, invigorating idea that could change everything. But as the excitement wore off, reality started to settle in. The challenges she had once only heard about were now right in front of her, waiting to be faced. She began by researching everything she could about homelessness. She read articles, watched documentaries, and spoke with experts in the field. The statistics were staggering. Millions of people in the United States alone were homeless, many due to mental health issues, addiction, or a simple lack of affordable housing. The systems meant to help were often broken, underfunded, and difficult to navigate. She knew that Jack was right. People didn't need more charity. They needed a system that worked for them, not against them. But the more she learned, the more overwhelming the task seemed. She had no experience in social work or activism. Her background was in finance and corporate strategy, worlds apart from the grassroots action she was envisioning. She was just one person, one voice in a system that had been broken for decades. Could she really make a difference? The first real challenge came when she reached out to her network. Emily had always been able to leverage her connections for career advancement, but now she was trying to tap into them for something entirely different. She called a few of her colleagues from her corporate days, asking them to meet for coffee or lunch to discuss her new project. At first, the responses were polite but lukewarm. She could tell they didn't really understand what she was trying to do, and they certainly didn't see the need to get involved. They were too wrapped up in their own lives, their own successes, to give much thought to the homeless people Emily wanted to help. "Emily, this is admirable and all," one of her colleagues, Tom, had said when they met at a trendy cafe. "But you've got to understand that the world is the way it is for a reason. People end up on the streets because of their choices. You can't fix that. You can't change the system." Emily had been taken aback. She knew that his perspective was limited, shaped by his own privilege and success. She tried to explain the systemic issues that led to homelessness, how it wasn't just about individual choices, but about the lack of affordable housing, the mental health crisis, the inadequacies of the social safety nets. "I get what you're saying," Tom continued, not looking convinced. "But you need to think practically. What you're trying to do, it's going to take more than a few good intentions. The system is too big to change. You'll burn yourself out." Emily left that meeting feeling disheartened. It wasn't just Tom. Many of her colleagues shared the same perspective. They saw the homeless as faceless statistics, a problem that was too big, too complicated to fix. She was starting to wonder if they were right. But then, the next day, Emily received an email that would change everything. It was from a woman named Rachel, a social worker she had met at a fundraising event for a local nonprofit a few years back. Rachel had heard about Emily's new mission through mutual contacts and wanted to meet to discuss her ideas. "Maybe you've got something," Rachel's email read. "Let's talk." Emily didn't waste a second. She responded immediately, arranging to meet Rachel at a coffee shop the next morning. When they sat down, Rachel wasted no time getting straight to the point. She was in her mid-30s, with short brown hair and a calm but determined energy about her. She listened carefully as Emily explained her goals, how she wanted to create awareness about homelessness, break down the stereotypes, and build a network of resources that could help people like Jack. "I've worked in this field for years," Rachel said after a long pause. "And I've seen a lot of people come and go. They're passionate at first, but they burn out because they don't have the right support. They try to change the world, but the world is a big place. You need a plan, a strategy." Emily nodded. She had always been a strategist in her corporate life. If there was one thing she knew, it was how to break down a large problem into manageable steps. She had spent years building financial models, developing business plans, and navigating corporate politics. Now, she was going to have to apply that same mindset to a cause that was far more personal and much harder to tackle. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Emily said, her voice steady. "And I think you're right. I need to start small, one step at a time. But I also think I can bring something different to the table. I can use the skills I've honed in the corporate world, business strategy, networking, fundraising, to make a real impact. Rachel smiled, but it wasn't just a polite smile. There was respect in her eyes, a recognition that Emily might be onto something. "That's exactly what we need," she said. "We need more people like you. People who can think outside the box and apply different skills to solve old problems." But don't forget, Emily, this is going to be a long journey. It's going to take time, effort, and resources. And you're going to face setbacks. You'll hit walls. But if you stay committed, you'll make a difference. Over the next few weeks, Emily and Rachel began to collaborate on a plan. They started by identifying the most pressing needs: access to shelter, mental health services, and job training. They realized that homelessness was not just about a lack of housing, but also about the lack of support systems that could help people rebuild their lives. The first thing they did was set up a small community event to raise awareness. It wasn't much, just a few speakers, a small donation drive, and a community conversation about homelessness. But it was a start. They held it at a local community center, inviting people from all walks of life to attend. Emily spoke at the event, sharing her story and the story of Jack, the man who had shown her what real struggle looked like. At the event, Emily was amazed by the response. People who had never considered the issue of homelessness came up to her afterward, asking how they could help, how they could get involved. It wasn't a huge crowd, but the energy was palpable. For the first time, Emily felt like her mission was gaining traction. It wasn't just about raising awareness. It was about creating a conversation, a dialogue that had been missing for far too long. But as she left the event that night, feeling both exhausted and energized, she knew that the real work was just beginning. Raising awareness was the easy part. The harder part would be navigating the complex systems that perpetuated homelessness and creating lasting change. Jack's words echoed in her mind. "You're going to have to be ready for a fight." Emily was ready. She had made her first step, and there was no turning back now. As weeks passed, the small community event Emily had organized became the spark for something bigger. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The conversations were happening, the awareness was growing, and the momentum was beginning to build. But just as things seemed to be moving forward, Emily began to face a new and unexpected challenge: the overwhelming bureaucracy of the systems she was trying to navigate. Rachel had warned her that the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, but Emily hadn't fully understood the complexity of those obstacles. The nonprofit sector, though filled with passionate individuals, was also riddled with red tape. Trying to get government funding for homelessness initiatives was a nightmare of paperwork, endless meetings, and delays. Emily found herself spending hours just trying to get approval for a basic project that would offer job training to people in need. She spent days at City Hall, speaking with officials who were sympathetic to her cause, but ultimately unwilling to take any real action. It seemed like every door she tried to open was locked, and the keys were always somewhere out of reach. At the same time, Emily was still dealing with her corporate job. Although her bosses had noticed her increasing absences, they were beginning to get frustrated with her lack of availability. She had always been a high performer at work, but now her focus was split between her mission and her career. One afternoon, her boss, Mr. Harris, called her into his office. "Emily, we need to talk," he said, his tone unusually stern. "I've been noticing that your performance has been slipping lately. You've been missing meetings, missing deadlines. I understand you're passionate about this new project of yours, but you need to prioritize. If you're going to stay with this company, you need to start focusing on your job again." Emily's stomach churned. She had been expecting this conversation, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. She loved her job. She had worked hard to get where she was. But now, her heart wasn't in it. It was in the cause she had taken on, in the people like Jack who had opened her eyes to the truth. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harris," Emily began, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I've been juggling a lot, but I'm committed to getting back on track. I just need to figure some things out. My priorities have changed." Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "I understand that you're passionate, Emily, but passion alone won't pay the bills. You've got to think about your future here. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Emily felt torn. Her job was secure, stable. It offered everything she had ever wanted: success, financial stability, and the respect of her peers. But none of that seemed to matter now. She wasn't sure she could keep going in this corporate world, not if it meant sacrificing everything she now cared about. After the meeting, Emily sat at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen. She felt lost. She was getting nowhere in her work to help the homeless, and now her career was starting to unravel as well. She had never been one to give up, but this felt like a test of everything she believed in. She had always been taught to follow the path and to never stray from the course. But what if the course she was on wasn't the one she was meant to follow anymore? That night, Emily met Rachel again to discuss the next steps for the homeless initiative. Rachel could sense Emily's frustration the moment she walked in. "Something's off," Rachel said, her sharp eyes scanning Emily's face. "What's going on?" Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I'm stuck. I feel like I'm failing everywhere. The systems are broken, and no one's willing to listen. I keep getting pushed into corners at work. I don't know how much longer I can juggle this. I don't even know if I can make this work anymore." Rachel leaned forward, her expression serious. "Listen, Emily, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. But that's the point. If it were easy, everyone would be doing it. You're hitting walls because the system is designed to keep people like you out. It's not going to just give you the resources you need. You have to fight for them, every step of the way." "I know that," Emily replied, frustration creeping into her voice. "But it's not just the system. It's everything. I feel like I'm losing my job. I'm not making any real progress with the homeless initiative, and I don't know how much longer I can keep pushing." Rachel paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. "Look, Emily, I can tell you what you want to hear, that it's going to be okay. But that's not the reality. You're going to hit setbacks, and some days it's going to feel like you're not moving at all. But if you believe in this, if you really want to make a difference, you've got to push through. Not just for you, but for people like Jack who have been forgotten." Emily's eyes stung. She had never wanted to give up. She wasn't the type to quit, but she was exhausted. Her personal life was on the line, her career, her passion. It all seemed to be falling apart at once. Yet, Rachel's words rang in her ears. "If you believe in this, you've got to push through." It wasn't easy, but Emily knew she had to keep going. The next day, Emily made a decision. She would take a leave of absence from her job. She needed the time to refocus, to devote herself entirely to the cause she had started. It wasn't a decision she made lightly. It would mean financial uncertainty, the possibility of losing her job entirely, and the judgment of others. But she couldn't stay in limbo forever. She had to make a choice. That evening, she sent an email to Mr. Harris requesting a leave of absence. As she clicked send, she didn't feel a sense of relief. Instead, she felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was finally taking control. With her leave of absence from work officially approved, Emily felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. The safety net of her corporate job had been a cushion, a stable foundation in her life. But now, with that safety net gone, she had no choice but to leap headfirst into the unknown. There was no turning back. The first few days were filled with endless paperwork and meetings. Emily had to learn the ropes of the nonprofit sector: fundraising, grant applications, partnerships. It was a whole new world, one that she was determined to master. The knowledge she'd gained from her corporate career helped her craft strategies, but the landscape was vastly different. People in the nonprofit world didn't think in the same way as corporate executives. They had different priorities, different challenges. One evening, after another exhausting day of meetings with potential donors and partners, Emily collapsed onto her couch at home. The silence was deafening. Her phone buzzed, breaking the quiet. It was a text from Rachel. "Big news. Call me." Emily's heart skipped a beat. What could it be? Could it be something related to the initiative she'd been working on? She quickly dialed Rachel's number, eager for any good news. "Hey, Rachel, what's going on?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "You won't believe it." Rachel's voice was filled with excitement. "I've got a lead. There's a new organization that's willing to partner with us, an investor who's passionate about homelessness. They're interested in funding some of our programs. We could actually make this happen. The funding is real, and they want to see results." Emily sat up straight, her eyes wide. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. The kind of game-changing opportunity that could put her mission on the map. "Are you serious?" she asked, almost not daring to believe it. "I'm serious," Rachel said, her voice brimming with confidence. "This could be the turning point we've been hoping for, but we need to move fast. I've already arranged a meeting with them tomorrow. Be ready. We've got one shot at this." The excitement surged through Emily like a rush of adrenaline. After all the setbacks, all the doubts, all the moments when she had felt like quitting, this was the break she had been working for. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, it felt like things were finally aligning. That night, she stayed up late, preparing for the meeting. She reviewed the statistics, polished her pitch, and gathered all the data she could find on homelessness, on the impact of job training programs, mental health services, and housing first initiatives. Everything she'd learned over the past few months had led to this moment. She knew that if she could just convey her vision clearly enough, this investor might be the key to making it all real. The next morning, Emily arrived at the meeting with Rachel. They walked into a sleek conference room with high-end furniture and a panoramic view of the city, a far cry from the small community center where Emily had held her first event. The investor, a man named William Hart, was already sitting at the table. He was in his mid-50s, wearing a tailored suit and a calm, collected expression. "Emily, Rachel, nice to meet you," William said, shaking their hands with a firm grip. "I've heard a lot about the work you're doing. Let's see if this is something we can make happen." The meeting started off with introductions, but soon Emily was in full presentation mode. She shared the vision she had developed, the programs they wanted to launch, and the ways in which they would measure success. She spoke with passion, drawing on everything she had learned over the last few months. William was quiet as he listened, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. She couldn't tell whether he was impressed or skeptical. But then, as she finished her pitch, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Interesting," he said, his voice steady. "But I need to know more. What's your plan for long-term sustainability? What happens when the funding runs out?" Emily took a deep breath. This was the tough part, the part where her corporate experience would really shine. She explained how they intended to build a self-sustaining model by combining grants, private donations, and partnerships with businesses. She outlined the programs they would implement, the impact they would have, and how they planned to expand in the future. William listened intently, occasionally asking questions that made Emily think critically about the details. She answered as best she could, staying calm and focused despite the pressure mounting in her chest. Finally, after what felt like hours of back and forth, William leaned forward and smiled. "I like what I'm hearing. I think this could be something special. Let's take it to the next step. We'll start with a pilot program. If that works, we can talk about scaling it." Emily's heart leapt. This was it, the breakthrough she had been waiting for. "Thank you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This means everything to us. We won't let you down." As they left the meeting, Rachel turned to Emily, her face lit up with excitement. "We did it. This is our chance, Emily. We're going to change lives." For the first time since she had started this journey, Emily felt like she was truly on the right path. It wasn't just about Jack anymore. It was about every person who had been left behind, every person who deserved a chance at a better life. They were going to make it happen, and they were going to do it together. The following months were a whirlwind. Emily and Rachel, armed with the funding from William Hart and the backing of a growing network of supporters, launched their pilot program. They worked tirelessly, navigating the complexities of establishing new initiatives, recruiting volunteers, and organizing job training workshops for those experiencing homelessness. Emily saw firsthand how small changes could lead to big transformations. The first group of participants in the job training program was learning new skills, and some were already securing part-time jobs. It was a glimmer of hope, but for Emily, it was everything. She had witnessed the effects of poverty and hopelessness up close, and she knew that each success, no matter how small, was worth fighting for. The real breakthrough came when they secured a partnership with a local housing authority. The collaboration allowed them to offer housing vouchers to the participants who completed the job training. The feeling of seeing someone move from the street into their own apartment was indescribable. Emily watched as tears of gratitude filled the eyes of those who had once felt invisible to the world. It was moments like this that made all the struggle, the sleepless nights, and the sacrifices worth it. One day, Emily found herself sitting in a small coffee shop with Rachel, reflecting on how far they had come. The world around them buzzed with the normal, everyday noise of city life. But for Emily, it felt like everything had shifted. She had found her true calling. It wasn't just about helping the homeless. It was about restoring dignity, offering hope, and giving people the chance to rebuild their lives. "I can't believe it," Emily said, her voice filled with wonder. "We've really done it. It feels surreal." Rachel smiled, sipping her coffee. "We're just getting started, Emily. This is only the beginning." Emily leaned back in her chair, her thoughts drifting to Jack, the homeless man who had sparked this entire journey. She had never told him about the progress they were making, about the lives that were being changed. In a way, she felt he was still out there, a part of everything they were doing. She had learned so much from him, about the struggles of the invisible, about the power of human connection, and most of all, about the strength of the human spirit. "Do you ever think about Jack?" Emily asked Rachel, her voice quiet. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "All the time. He's the reason we're here, isn't he?" Emily smiled softly. "I think he's the reason we're here, and the reason I'm finally living my truth." As Emily looked out the window of the coffee shop, she saw a homeless man sitting on the corner, his belongings neatly piled beside him. She felt a familiar ache in her chest, the same feeling that had driven her to start this journey in the first place. But now, that ache was tempered with determination. She was no longer just an observer. She was part of the solution. She wasn't going to stop until every person who had been forgotten by society had the chance to be seen, to be heard, and to be given the opportunities they deserved. The mission was far from over. There were more lives to touch, more systems to challenge, and more hearts to change. Emily was ready for whatever came next because she knew this was her purpose. It wasn't just about one person or one cause. It was about changing the way the world viewed homelessness and giving everyone the dignity and opportunity they deserved. As she and Rachel walked out of the coffee shop, Emily paused and looked up at the sky. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over the city. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh start. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but she had learned that with passion, perseverance, and the support of people who believed in her vision, anything was possible. And in that moment, Emily knew this was only the beginning.